Welcome to Word Plays at Proctor's, currently on Zoom. My name is Kate Dudding. I'm one of the producers of Word Plays, along with Joe Doolittle and Siri Allison. We are in our 14th season, and we are in the middle of our 14th season of Zooming. We have 3 more performances scheduled after this, the second Sundays of February, March, and April. Today's topic is priceless. The best things in life aren't things. Family is priceless. Happiness and passion are priceless. Self-esteem is priceless. Each one of our stories is going to be talking about that topic of priceless. We will be taping this performance. We'd like our listeners to be muted while each story is being told, because we know things happen, like a husband might come in with your mobile phone saying that your brother wants to talk, or a cat or whatever. So we'd like you to be muted while each story is being told. At the end, you can applaud silently, either, visibly, or this is the way deaf people applaud. It shows up very nicely on Zoom. Or you can unmute yourself and applaud.
You can also use the icon.
Oh, and yes, that voice you hear is Claire Nolan, who is our technical guru and who has our backs. Thank you, Claire, for being here. We will have 4 stories, then a brief intermission, only about 4 minutes, enough for you to get up and visit whatever room you might want to visit and come back. And I think that's all the things you need to know so we can get started. Oh, yes. I generally try to connect the stories in word plays by asking each teller the same question, and then I get to share their answer before they tell. Today's question was, if your story was a food, what would it be? Marnie Gillard said her food would be humble pie. She is going to share a personal story with us called My First Time in Trouble in School. Marnie, over to you.
Okay. When I had a young son, I sent him, with his dad's agreement, to a very pricey private school for pre-K, kindergarten, and first. And after a while, it just sort of seemed to us, besides the priciness, there were other factors, and there was a wonderful public school where his dad lived. And I went to visit it for a whole day and was fascinated, and I loved the school. And so from 2nd to 5th grade, he was in a public school in the Bethlehem School District. And he really loved it, and it was a great experience for him. When he was in 5th grade, I was on leave and I was learning about how to be a storyteller in other schools and things like that. I had been a school teacher myself, a public school teacher, but I took a leave and I gave freelancing a try. And I went to his school in the after school hours one day because the school had gotten to know me and invited me to do a little workshop for some teachers on how to get storytelling going in your classroom. So I love to do that. There's nothing I like more than teaching people about the joy and delight of using storytelling in the classroom. So I went to that classroom, and my son then was in 5th grade, and he came to the workshop and just sat in the back of the room because he was working on homework, and then, we'd drive home together. So I did a few things with folk tales and fairy tales and introduced them to 398.2 if they didn't know that in their library, all the place where you could find great folk tales, and helping the children find one that touched them, that really, really zoomed into them. And they'd said, oh, I want to tell that story. So we did a little bit of that. But near the end of the workshop, I said, there's nothing like telling a life story to your class. So think about the topic, my first time, whatever. It could be any kind of first time. First time you rode your bike, first time, I heard a wonderful story once from a boy, first time I went to a funeral house where my grandmother was in a casket. Wow. And he told the most amazing, it was kind of funny actually, story about the experience. Well, anyway, everybody was talking about possible firsts, and I put people in partners, or they put themselves in partners. And once they really got going and they had a certain amount of time, plenty of time, then I wandered to the back of the room and I talked to my son, Brian. He was 10 at the time. And I said, how you doing? Are you working on your homework? He said, yeah, I got most of my homework done. Do you want to hear my first time? I said, oh, you got a story about your first time? He said, my first time in trouble in school. And I said, don't I know this story? It's not jumping into my brain, but there's my humble pie. I was sort of, when did Brian get in trouble? And I don't know the story. And he said, okay, you might want to sit down, Mom. Oh, no. So he said, it was in first grade. And I knew Brian had loved pre-K and he had loved kindergarten, but he had not loved his first grade teacher. And I can't say as I loved her so much myself, because one thing I knew is that Brian had a buddy, and his buddy didn't like to write. This was first grade. And Brian loved to write. So Brian would write all his stories. And the other boy liked to draw. And so he drew all the pictures for Brian's stories. And the teacher had no clue that was happening. Anyway, I said to Brian, well, when is this, what happened? This is something that happened in first grade. He said, it was one of those wonderful days, Mom. It was so beautiful outside and we were playing kickball at recess. I loved kickball. I loved it. And then suddenly, ding, 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 the bell rang and it was time to go in. I didn't want to go in. I wanted to stay and play some more. But everybody lined up. And I thought, I'm not being bad. I'm just going slow. So I hid in the bushes. And my whole class lined up and they all went. It was a long playground. So they had to walk down the playground and then in the school door. And I was just sitting in the bushes and thinking, I'm not being bad. I'm just going slower than everyone. And finally I got up and I started taking just little baby steps, really slow baby steps. And when I got near the door and no one was there, they'd all gone back in the school building, I looked up and my entire classroom was looking at me. They were all looking down at me. And I liked that. I knew I was the star. So I went to the door, and there was my teacher standing at the door. She opened the door and she had a mad look on her face, and she took me by the arm and she said, "It's music now. I'll walk you to music. We'll talk later." And she walked me very strictly to music class. And I walked inside, and all my friends were there, and they were all looking at me. And my best friend, Billy, went like, "Good job, you pulled it off." And the teacher just frowned and sent me into the room and went back to her classroom. And that was the first time I got in trouble in school. And I said, "Gee, Brian, I am humbled to hear that story that you have had inside you all your life, and you never told me this. And here you are in 5th grade." And I said, for me, it isn't a story about really getting in trouble. You didn't get in much trouble, right? Because no, she yelled at me a little, but it was when my friend Billy gave me that "good job" sign. I knew it was the right thing to do. And I said, this is maybe for you the first time you got in trouble. But for me, it's when I hear your story, it's about a story about claiming yourself, something inside yourself that was powerful. And you said, "I'm going to claim this. And if it gets me in a little trouble, oh well." Now, I wouldn't give that advice to other parents, really, but my own young son, it just blew my mind. And I'll tell you one more thing. When he was 17, maybe even 18, but I think it was more like just before he turned 18, and he was in his senior year at high school. He had lots of essays to write to send off with college applications. If you've had students or friends or children doing that, you know what I mean. And one of those essays was this story. Now, he told it very differently as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old. He might have even mentioned how he really knew it was about him claiming himself, and that was something he would do all of his life. I don't really remember for sure, but I knew when I read that version, I did not have any fear of sending my child to college and out into the world. And he's turning 42 in just a few weeks. And he is finding the self he always wanted to be and being that in the world. And that's my story. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Marnie. Thank you for sharing that priceless set of family stories with us. Now, our next teller is Beverly Schwartz, and she is telling a personal story with historical information woven in. When I asked her about what food her story was like, she said, "A banana split with all different kinds of ice cream and lots of different kinds of toppings and syrups." I hope no one runs off to get that right now. But Bev, why don't you tell us more about the clue that helped find the Titanic?
Hello. I was a teacher in third grade, and I was asked because of a program I created to go to the New York State Engineer Society annual meeting in downtown Albany, New York. And I was going to be one of the speakers. Well, I came and went to the stage, and they said, "We're going to start right now." And they sat me down to a man. And I said, "Oh, I know him from somewhere." And before I could even say hello to him, boom, they called my name, and I went up and I presented my story of what I did, and they presented me with an award, and they sat me down, and then this man came up, and as soon as they said his name, I knew who he was. It was David Ballard, the man who found the Titanic and led the team that did it. Well, I was so excited because I was hoping to have a conversation with him sometime that day so my kids would know that I met him, because my class had just finished a whole unit on finding the Titanic and the oceans. Well, after we were done, there was a luncheon, and to my surprise, they sat both of us at the same table next to each other. And we all started eating, and everyone was asking him all these scientific and technical questions. And I was not only one of the only women at the table, but very few women were in that room, I noticed. Well, when everyone started eating and the food was served, I turned around and I looked at Mr. Ballard. And I said, "I bet you get all these questions and all these events you go to." And he goes, "Yep, most of the questions are all about, similar things. And I'm not used to this by now." So then I got in close and I looked at him and I said, "Do you have a story about finding the Titanic that you've never told anyone? No one, that I can bring back to my class and tell them that I met you and tell your story?" Well, he looked at me and he said, "Yes, I do. I have a story, but I don't want to have the rest of the table hear this story. I want it just for you." "Okay," I said. "What is he going to tell me?" Well, we leaned close, shoulder to shoulder was touching. Our eyes were meeting each other, and he started his story. He said the little submarine that we all created had a window, because we had to see if we were approaching any boat that we're looking for. And we saw many different boats on the bottom of the ocean as we looked for the Titanic. On this venture, when we were looking for the Titanic, on the bottom of the ocean is always a debris field of things that have fallen down when the ships go down. And they're in the bottom of the ocean, in the sand stuck on the bottom. Now, he started seeing things like chests and pieces of silverware and plates and all this debris that had been there probably for years and years, and more than years and years if it was the Titanic. And then he says there's a string that goes round and round and round sunken ships, because there's like streams of water in the ocean. And other debris gets floated in this stream and goes round and round and round, all forever. So he was getting excited. He saw some debris, and then they saw the stream of things floating. So they knew there was a ship coming. And then all of a sudden, whoosh, and right at the window was a doll's head. It was a porcelain doll's head. And the eyes were blinking on, off, on, off, on, off. It scared him. Was this an omen? What was going to happen? And then he had a pit in his stomach. And he thought, there was precious lives that were lost. And this was a little girl's head of a doll that she might have loved and carried and talked about, and she herself had a life which would probably have had a good story. But her and all the other children and their parents and other people that were on the boat lost their precious lives when the Titanic sank. And it was a humanist thought that he was having, not like the scientific engineer part, but it hit him. Not only was he doing something scientifically, but it was a human feeling of those who were lost. And just when he was finished thinking that, whoosh, the doll's head passed by. Oh, he let out a breath, he said. Then he stared closer into the window, and more debris was coming around. And just as he thought they were getting closer, whoosh, the doll's head came back. And this time it stayed for a very short time. And just like once or twice, like giving him the message, now you know, it wasn't just finding a boat. Precious lives were lost. Whoosh, the doll went, and off it went. And very shortly afterwards, they saw the Titanic and all the debris around it and the different layers of the ship. They had decided before, with the scientists and the engineers that were looking for the Titanic, that this was a graveyard, and they didn't want to desecrate it by going and taking stuff from the ship. So they decided that they would be taking pictures. And these pictures, he said, would be shared with the world, but they would never tell anyone where the ship was located because they were afraid that people would try to come and take some of the stuff on the bottom of the ocean where the Titanic lay as a graveyard. He looked at me. Did you like the story? And I said, yeah. I said, well, you know what my kids are going to ask? He goes, no, what? And he said, were there any skeletons? Did you see any skeletons? And he laughed and he said, no, we did not see skeletons. Well, we finished our lunch and everyone was saying goodbye. And of course, everyone wanted to shake his hand and everything. So when he was almost done, he saw me standing there and he came up to me and I said, thank you so much for your story. I really enjoyed it. But I have one more question. You have another question? He asked me and he's laughing. I said, I really do. And I said, you know, I'm going to tell my class the story tomorrow and they're going to get excited. Could you write them a little note and sign it to know that I'm not just making it up? He said, of course. And he wrote a very beautiful note. He signed it and I read it to the kids the next day and we framed it in our classroom. And sure enough, when I told the story to the class and when I was done, what was the first question they asked? Were there any skeletons? Thank you.
Bev, what a priceless story.
Thank you.
And what good questions you ask. We're so glad you asked those questions. But I hope none of you have any nightmares tonight about China dolls' heads blinking at you ominously.
When I went to the classroom, I have a childhood doll, porcelain, that I got when I was 3 years old, taller than me. And I still had the doll and it had the blinking eyes. And before I told the story, I had the doll next to me.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. Thank you, Bev. Now our next teller is Mary Murphy. And she's going to, when I asked her the question, what food her story, which is a Chinese folktale, was like, she said, it's the emperor's soup. But each listener gets to decide what his favorite soup is. So think about that for just a little moment while Mary Murphy comes to the forefront. And she will also pronounce the title of the story because I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. So Mary Murphy, would you take it away, please?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. This is my very, very first Zoom storytelling. And I'm very pleased to be doing it. But I'm a little nervous. So if technology fails me, it's all right. We'll just learn from our mistakes. I'm going to start with a poem by a short poem by Shel Silverstein. A piece of sky broke off and fell through the crack in the ceiling right into my soup. Kerplop. I really must state that I usually hate lentil soup, but I ate every drop. Delicious, delicious. A bit like plaster, but so delicious, goodness sake, I could have eaten a lentil soup lake. It's amazing the difference a bit of sky can make. Now, the name of my story is The Fabulous Feng Huang, and here it is. Everyone in China knows that the phoenix, the mystical, magical bird, or Feng Huang as it is called in China, is a beautiful bird with its tail as blue and fine as a peacock's, and its scarlet head and breast and back. This phoenix, the Feng Huang, has huge wings that are colorful, and its eyes are as blue as the sea. Now, not only is the phoenix a beautiful bird, but it is a noble and wise creature. It is seldom seen by anyone, but when it is seen, it hovers over treasure. Treasure that can make anyone rich in goods of the world. Now, one day there was a peasant, and he was walking on the road, down the road with his hoe, going to his marshy fields to begin his long day of work. And as he was walking, not really wanting to go there, he saw something out of the corner of his eye. And he turned, and half hidden in the reeds, he saw it. He saw the fabulous Feng Huang. There it was. He knew it right away from all the stories he heard as a child. It was as beautiful and colorful as anybody had ever told him. And he ran towards it. It was hovering, and it began to fly up into the air as soon as it saw him, with its huge wings flapping. And he watched it. He couldn't take his eyes off it. And finally, when it disappeared, he looked down. And he saw the dirt over which the Feng Huang had been hovering. And he said, the Feng Huang always brings treasure. And so he ran right there towards it, and he moved the dirt aside, and it was marshy and wet, so he moved it with his hands. And then he had his hoe, and so he began to dig and dig and dig deeper and deeper. He was waiting to find the gems and the gold and all of the silver, but he didn't find anything. So he dug deeper and deeper and deeper. And at last he realized that there was nothing in that hole. It was only dirt. So he lifted up a clod of the dirt, and he looked at it and he said, this dirt must be the treasure. The Feng Huang always brings treasure. And so he wrapped it up in an old rag that he had, and he took it home. And when he saw his wife, he told her everything about the Feng Huang and the dirt and how he dug and dug and dug, and this is all he found. And they put the dirt in the center of the table, and she sat on one side and he sat on the other, and they looked at it, trying to figure out what was the treasure. But they could not. Finally, his wife said, well, you know, husband, you have to take this to the emperor tomorrow. And he knew that because it was a rule that anyone who found a treasure in the kingdom had to bring it to the emperor to report it. And so the next day, she took the clod of dirt and she wrapped it in the finest cloth that she had, one she made herself, and put it into a basket and handed it to the peasant. He dressed in his best clothes, but they were still only his work clothes. But he went to tell the emperor about the great treasure, the dirt. And so as he walked, he got more and more excited because he saw people, and he saw more and more houses. And as he got to the capital, he saw vendors and street markets and colorful food and vegetables and clothing. And oh, it was a wonderful place. People were rushing around all around him. He'd never seen so many people. And as he got to the end of the street, there was the palace. The huge palace, beautiful, the most beautiful building he'd ever seen or could imagine. And there was a long stairway going up, and there were guards all around. And he was very nervous, but he went up to one of the guards and he said, "I've got a treasure for the emperor. Please let me in." And the guard eventually took him into the throne room. It took a long time, and he was getting more and more tired, but he was so excited. When he walked into that magnificent throne room, he didn't even see the emperor at first, but the emperor was on his throne. Oh, what a majestic figure. And the little man, the little peasant, he bowed low and he said, "Oh, emperor, I have found a treasure, thanks to the Feng Huang, and now I want to give it to you." And the emperor said, "Well, bring it forward." And one of the guards took the basket and went right up to the throne itself and handed the basket to the emperor. And he moved aside the cloth and he looked in and he said, "Well, what is this?" And the little man, he said, "Well, this is the treasure I was telling you about. It's from the Feng Huang. It's dirt, but there must be something very, very special about this dirt." And the emperor was furious. He said, "You came here to give me this basket of dirt? Well, you're trying to make a fool of me. Now, what I want to say to you is, you are going to the dungeon because nobody makes a fool out of the emperor. Guards, take him away." And sure enough, that was it. They took him to the dungeon and they locked him in. And somebody took the basket and they put it on a high shelf in the pantry. And nobody gave it another thought. And they didn't give another thought to the peasant either. And weeks went by. And then one day, the royal chef, the head chef, was making dinner for his emperor. And he always made and started with the soup, the very special soup that the emperor loved more than anything. And he was the only one that knew how to make it. And so when he made it, he brought it into the emperor himself. And so he carried the bowl proudly through the pantry. And just as he was almost in the dining room, one of the servants brushed past him, knocked him into the shelves, and the shelves began to shake, and the basket tipped on its side, and the dirt fell into the bowl of soup. Oh, the chef couldn't believe his eyes. He was almost in the dining hall, but he had to go back. He had to get another bowl of soup, so he turned around to go back, but the emperor saw him. He said, "I am hungry. Bring me that soup at once. What are you waiting for?" And so, with the bowl shaking in his trembling hands, he brought it into the emperor and put it down in front of him. He was wringing his hands. His sweat was on his brow. How could he put some dirt in front of the emperor in that soup? But the emperor didn't know anything. And he took the soup spoon and he dipped it in the soup and he drank. And he took another slurp of the soup and and then he took a third and he slurped it in. And he said, "Now wait a minute. You put something new in this soup, didn't you? Some new ingredient that is magnificent. You made it an even better soup. I'm proud of you, my man. Now, what did you put in this soup?" And the chef was trying to think up many, many lies he could tell about this. But instead, because it was the emperor, he told him the truth. He said, "Oh, emperor, as I was going through the pantry, some of the dirt from that peasant's basket, the one who talked about the Feng Huang, well, the basket fell on its side and some of the dirt fell into the soup. I'm so sorry. And he thought, the soup was flavored by the dirt from the peasant. And he said, bring me that basket. Bring me that basket at once. And so they did. And he pushed the soup aside and he dumped over the basket, and the dirt was on the table. Now, he knew all the stories about the Feng Huang, just like the peasant did. He learned all those stories as a child, but he never believed any of them, and he never thought much about it. But could it be that there is something in this dirt? So he spent some time just moving it aside gently. He began to notice something in the dirt. It was filled with crystals, tiny white crystals everywhere. And so he took one of the crystals and he wiped it off as best he could, and he put it on his tongue. And he said, that's it. This is what is flavoring that soup. And he sent his men out to the fields where the peasant had dug. And sure enough, they found that white crystal all over in miles and miles of land around the palace. And he said, this is the treasure from the Feng Huang. And from now on, all of our food will be flavored with this magic crystal. Now, can anyone out there in video land tell me what you think that crystal might have been?
Salt?
Oh, good guess. And it's right. It was salt. That's how the Feng Huang brought salt to China. Now, the peasant, he was an honorable man, and the emperor was equally as honorable. And so he called for the peasant to be brought to him. And he was going to apologize. But he found out that the peasant had died in prison of neglect. His wife didn't even know where he was. And the emperor wept for him. And then he called for his wife and the whole family of that peasant to be brought. It was the son and the son's family and the wife, who had no idea what had happened to her husband. And he told them what he did and how sorry he was. And he put that son in charge of all the fields that contained that crystal, that delicious crystal. And so the son and his family became wealthy beyond measure. And in that way, the peasant was honored by his son and all of the kingdom. And that's how salt was brought to China by the Feng Huang. And that, well, we don't really know how they got MSG. But one thing we do know, the Feng Huang always brings treasure. Thank you. Thank you.
Mary, thank you so much.
Oh,
You
you're
made-
welcome.
You made a wonderful Zoom debut, and we're all
Yes, this is one for the history books. I'll be back.
You
Great.
better be. That was great.
Thank you. Thank you
I
very much.
always thought the emperor's favorite soup was chicken noodle myself, but
A simple man of simple tastes. There. Joe Doolittle.
Oh. So thank you so much, Mary.
Okay, you're welcome.
And now our next teller is one of my producing partners, Joe Doolittle. He will be telling an historic story. The food that's related to that is, a wonderful entree. Sockeye salmon marinated in Russian vodka and dill. And the title of his story is The Rewards of Seward's Folly. Joe Doolittle.
thank you so much. And it was just great to be on this card with the other tellers. So when Kate gave me the title for the theme for this program, it was Priceless. And I said, well, that's probably, what do I got? Well, I always wanted to do a story about Seward's folly and the reality of that. But even as a history major, I didn't have an appreciation for all the context of that decision. And I could never understand how a guy like William Seward, who, if you look at his history, he was the rival to Abraham Lincoln and lost the nomination. And then Lincoln appointed him as Secretary of State and they became close. And before that, he'd been a senator and he'd been a governor and he's a graduate of Union College in our fair city here, Schenectady. How does someone like Seward pull off a folly? Now, I'm going to start this part of my story in March 29th of 1867. And to set the context, Seward is still Secretary of State under President Andrew Johnson. And he's recovered as much as he is going to from the terrible attack he encountered at the same time that Lincoln was assassinated. And he is the master of being the coach of presidents. It's really what he did with Lincoln. They became close and intimate, and they talked a lot, and Lincoln took his guidance. Now, Andrew Johnson wasn't a Lincoln, and it was harder for Seward to coach Seward because he wasn't as smart or as well thought of. One of the things that was really going on at that time politically is that Seward had been the governor of Tennessee. So he had some Southern leanings, and he was not as adamant about imposing harsh circumstances on the Confederate States. And the radical Republicans, as they were called then, were adamant about holding the Confederates' feet to the fire. And Seward and many other people were much more inclined to kind of try to find middle ground and let everybody come back together and see what could move ahead forward. But that animosity was so strict. He and Johnson were meeting one day and they were looking for a political diversion. Now, the background for this is that the Russians had lost the Crimean War, were very suspicious of Great Britain, and needed money. And one of their losers was Alaska. They'd mined it and harvested all the furs. It was too far away to really govern from Moscow. And if they could unload it, they'd get some cash. And if they didn't unload it, they figured that the Americans or the British would overrun it anyway if there was any adventure there around gold or anything, like even catching fish. So they began to approach the United States government about buying Alaska because they didn't want to sell it to the Brits. And in that little dichotomy, things got a little bit mixed up and extended because of the Civil War. But in that conversation with Johnson, Seward suggests, why don't we buy Alaska? It fills a lot of needs. It's kind of a niche for our next round of expansion in the West. If we buy Alaska, we might be able to squeeze the Canadians and pick up British Columbia sometime. And it's got to be worth a lot because it's big and there's things we could do there. And the dialogue on that might diminish some of the dialogue on the other stuff. So Seward goes and re-engages the Russians. And on March 29th, they were about in their final negotiations. And the Russian says to Seward, he says, $7 million is not enough for all we're going to give you. You got to come up with some more cash. Well, Seward had started originally at 5, and 7 was a lot of money in those days, but it actually comes out to be only 2 cents an acre for a whole state of Alaska. So he sent a message to Seward, or to Johnson and the Secretary of the Treasury, and they gave him another $200,000, and that sealed the deal. But by the time that happened, they'd been sitting around that negotiating table for 18 hours, and it was now 3 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of March. But the deal was done. They had some vodka, they had some whatever else they ate, and they sent the treaty to the Senate to ratify. The Senate ratified it, and bingo, the deal was done. And in that fall of 1867, there was an official ceremony, and the U.S. took over Alaska. Now, the political strife was such that some of the people who didn't like the goings-on of Seward and Andrew Johnson, even though the purchase fit exactly into the manifest destiny philosophy of the country at the time, they wanted to ridicule Seward and Johnson. And the principal person that did that was a guy named Horace Greeley. He was the editor of the New York Tribune, which is the most powerful newspaper in the country at the time. And he was a good friend of William Seward. Seward had helped Greeley get elected to Congress 15 years earlier. It was like ironic that he could come off with, and he invented the term Seward's folly. The other Greeleyism that we live with to this day is that idea of "go west, young man," because that was another Greeley quote that carried. And so it gets remembered as the folly because of the anachronism of making something wonderful look bad. And I hope to tell you that Andrew Johnson's problems with Congress and with those right-wing Republicans didn't end. They impeached him on 12 counts of processes that weren't to their liking about the handling of the Reconstruction era. And as you know, he wasn't convicted by only one vote. But the acrimony of that impeachment and the nature of the political situation later is that he was certainly not a candidate for presidency, and that Ulysses S. Grant was elected president on the Republican ticket in his stead. Now, the old warrior Seward was still in the game, and he really wanted to serve Grant. He'd known Grant as a general during the Civil War. He admired him when Lincoln he were confidants. But Grant didn't issue an invitation. And Seward retired to Auburn, New York, which is where he was from. And after a month in Auburn, New York, after all the activity he'd been involved with over his career, he was bored. And he convinced his daughter and son-in-law to accompany him on a trip west. And he got on the train right in Auburn, because the trains ran all the way across the country. The golden spike that connected the rails was laid down in 1863. So he had a magnificent trip west. And after a week in San Francisco, he took a boat north to Alaska. And when he got to Sitka, which was the only real settled town, from his boat, he gazed around. He sat outside at 10 o'clock at night in daylight to have dinner. He had a little vodka from his Russian server. And he had sockeye salmon marinated in vodka, sprinkled with dill for dinner. And he looked around and said, "No folly, priceless."
Priceless.
Oh,
Very good.
The postscript on this is that when Johnson was getting ready to leave the presidency, the custom was that the incoming and the outgoing president rode to the inauguration in the same carriage. And Ulysses Grant would not ride in the same carriage with Johnson. So
How about that?
Johnson didn't go to the inauguration.
Ah,
Times don't change. They just kind of change the course of the situation a bit.
Clothes do.
Thank you, Joe. It's a lot of history I never knew.
Well, neither did I before you encouraged me to come up with a story about something. So there you go. Thank you.
What I'm thinking is they're going to take a break now.
Yes. Well, we are going to take a break now. And before I do, I want to share a few slides with you. We realize that many people have been financially impacted by COVID-19. Any amount that you would be able to donate to our tellers would be greatly appreciated. This information is also in the chat. This performance will be rebroadcast by Public Access TV, Open Stage Media's Arts and Ed channel, which is run by our host, Proctors, and it will also be available on our YouTube, or our website, storycircle@proctors.org. And if you go to our website, you can find out about other virtual events that are happening in the month. It's listed in the upper right-hand corner of every page on our website, storycircle@proctors.org. Now we're going to take a 4-minute break. So welcome back. Welcome back for the second half. And we will be starting off this second half with Claire Nolan. There you are. Claire Nolan is telling an Apache folktale called Coyote and the Money Tree. When I asked her about what food that story reminded her of, she said, strong black campfire coffee. So take it away, Claire.
Thanks, Kate. And I'd just like to echo what Beverly said at the beginning, thanking Kate for all that she does to put together these wonderful programs. And it's so great to see so many faces here this afternoon, I guess evening now here in New York. So thank you. Coyote was out walking. Coyote was out walking in those canyons that he loves so much. And late in the afternoon, those canyons with the setting sun were about the exact same color as Coyote himself. And while Coyote was out walking, he could smell all kinds of wonderful, wonderful smells. And he could hear so much. And as Coyote was out walking in those canyons, he smelled some prospectors. He could smell their bodies sweating in that hot afternoon sun. He could smell their fat donkeys. He could smell the leather of the harnesses, and he could smell the food. Coyote could hear them. He could hear those prospectors, and he could smell them long before he saw them. He could hear the jangle of the harnesses, and he could hear the pots and pans as those fat donkeys walked along the canyon trail. He could hear the prospectors laughing and joking. And those prospectors that Coyote could hear and smell long before he could see them, those prospectors gave Coyote an idea. And as Coyote was out there walking, he found a tree. There weren't many trees out there, but he found one, and it was perfect right there on the trail. And Coyote cleared the ground around the bottom of the tree, picked up the twigs and the leaves, and he raked out the dirt, and oh, it was beautiful there under the tree. And then Coyote reached into his shirt pocket, and he took out 3 $1 bills, and he placed them carefully there among the leaves of the tree. And when everything was ready, Coyote sat down and he leaned against the warm bark of that tree, and he put his hat over his face, and he waited, because coyotes are very patient. He didn't have to wait long that afternoon, though, because soon enough, those prospectors came along the trail just as he knew they would. And they stopped there, right there in front of Coyote, and they said, Coyote, what are you doing out here on the trail all by yourself here in this afternoon sunlight? What are you doing, Coyote? And Coyote lifted up his hat and he looked at the prospectors, seemed surprised to see them there standing in front of him. And he said, hello, fellas. I'm just out here minding my money tree. Tell us another one, Coyote. A money tree? Who ever heard of a money tree? Money doesn't grow on trees. You got to dig in the ground and find gold if you want money. No, said Coyote. This is a money tree. A money tree that's been in my family for generations. Really, Coyote? Really? And the prospectors started to listen to him because Coyote seemed so serious about this money tree. Sure, he said. Why, my brothers and sisters were all out here this morning collecting the money that we shook out of this tree. Well, show us how it works, Coyote. Come on, we don't believe you. And Coyote said, well, I'll try. But as I said, we did shake out quite a bit of money this morning, but I'll give it a try. And Coyote put his hands around the trunk of that tree and he gave it a shake. And down out of the tree floated 3 $1 bills, and they floated to the ground as gracefully as 3 green butterflies. And those prospectors kneeled down in the dirt and they picked up those $1 bills, each of them. They looked at them. Coyote, this is real money, they said. These are real $1 bills that you shook out of this tree. Coyote said, I know, I told you it's a money tree. So 2 of the prospectors handed the dollar bills back to Coyote and he put them back in his pocket. But the 3rd kept that dollar bill and put it in his own pocket. Oh, Coyote, said the prospectors, you got to sell us this tree. Oh my goodness, we'd never have to dig in the dirt again looking for that gold. Why, if you sell us this tree, we'll be wealthy for the rest of our lives. Coyote, you have to sell it to us, please. Oh no, says Coyote, it's not my tree to sell. Belongs to my family. I told you that. It's been in my family for generations. Oh, Coyote, we'll give you these 3 fat donkeys if you'll give us the tree. No, says Coyote, I can't sell them. No, listen, Coyote, we'll give you the 3 fat donkeys and we'll throw in our leather belts with the big silver buckles. No, said Coyote, no, I can't sell this tree. And so they bargained with him. They offered him everything they had, not just the 3 fat donkeys, but everything on the donkeys, their blankets, their guns and ammunition, their prospecting tools, their pots and pans, all the food and liquor that they had. They offered it to Coyote just in exchange for that money tree. Well, at last, Coyote seemed to be persuaded. He said, oh, you guys drive a hard bargain. I guess I'll accept. I'll take everything you have. And in exchange, you'll get my money tree. Oh, thank you, Coyote. Thank you. And so they handed Coyote the reins of the lead donkey. And they took off their belts, those leather belts with the big silver buckles, and they gave them to Coyote, and he tucked them into one of the saddlebags. Coyote thanked them and he took the reins and he headed off down the trail. But then he stopped and he turned around. He said, oh, I'm sorry, fellas. I forgot to tell you the most important thing about this tree. Oh my goodness, this would have been terrible if I'd forgotten. You won't get any money out of this tree until tomorrow. Now you see that escarpment off in the east? That's where the sun's going to rise tomorrow morning. Wait until the sun has risen above the escarpment so that it's a big yellow ball in the sky and it's broad daylight. Then, only then, shake that tree and see what you get. Oh, Coyote, thank you. And so off he went, leading those 3 donkeys and everything the men owned. Well, those men heard the jangling of their pots and pans. They heard the creak of the harnesses, but not for very long, because coyotes have much better hearing than prospectors do. And off he went, leaving the prospectors there with their tree. Well, soon it got dark and cold. They built a little fire and they sat around it. They didn't have any food. The coyote had taken everything, but tomorrow they would be wealthy. They'd have everything they wanted to eat and to drink and more. And as I sat there around their little fire, they told each other stories of what they would buy when they had all that money. One of the men said, oh, I'm going to buy a ranch. I'm going to fill my ranch with beautiful horses. Oh, I'll be the wealthiest rancher around. A second one said, not me, I'm going to go back east. I'm going to go to a big city and open a restaurant, and people will come from miles around. They'll come and they'll eat my salmon. Why, it'll be soaked in vodka. They'll come and eat delicious soup that I make. Oh my goodness, and the hot fudge sundaes, it's going to be marvelous. Wait till you see my wonderful restaurant. Fancy men and women, wealthy men and women will come and they'll thank me for the delicious meals. Well, the third prospector, he didn't say much. He didn't know. No, I don't know. Let's see what we get tomorrow. I'm not too hopeful that anything's really going to happen. But if it does, I'll decide then what to spend my money on. And so at last, one by one, the three prospectors fell asleep. They woke early, long before the sun had risen, their stomachs, empty stomachs growling. They were so hungry. The fire had long since gone out. They found a little stream and drank some water and wet their faces. And they watched as the sky started to brighten. And they looked off into the east to that escarpment that Coyote had pointed out to them. And they watched as the sun began to rise a little bit, inch by inch. It started to clear that escarpment. It seemed to take forever. Had a sunrise ever taken so long? As that sun went up into the sky, and at last, look, there it is. It's above the escarpment now. Now we shake the tree. Now we get our money. And so the first of the prospectors went up to that tree, and he put his hands around it just as he had seen Coyote do, and he gave it a shake. But all that happened was a crow high in the tree flew off and cawed in its derision at them. Oh, said the second prospector, maybe you didn't shake it hard enough, or maybe the sun's not high enough. Let me try. And he put his hands around the trunk of that tree and he gave it a shake. But all that came down were some dead leaves and twigs. Not $1, not a penny, not a dime, not a nickel, nothing, no money came out of that tree. And the third of them said, well, I guess I may as well give it a try. And he put his hands around the tree and he gave it a shake, but nothing came out of the tree that time. And the three men looked at each other and they knew that Coyote had tricked them. So the two men, the two oldest of the prospectors, went off down the trail, down that canyon trail, and followed after Coyote. But the third waited until the other two were out of sight. And then he cleared that space under the tree of the leaves and the twigs, and he smoothed out the dirt. And then he took that $1 out of his pocket and he put it up into the tree and the leaves. And then he sat down and leaned against the trunk of the tree and put his hat over his face to wait. Because just like Coyote, prospectors can wait a very long time. Thank you.
Oh, Claire Nolan.
I gotta find your date. There you are.
A double ending, sort of. And what better way to start off a new year but with a good Coyote story? Yes. Told with great energy and verve by Claire Nolan. Thank you, Claire. Oh. And if one Claire isn't enough, we have a second Claire Beetlestone, who used to live sort of in our area, Cooperstown, but she would come to Word Place at Proctor's, but now she's in Philadelphia, but she's still with us. Aren't we lucky? She's going to take us to Mexico for a folktale from there called The Emerald Lizard. And her food is a substantial bowl of oatmeal, filling and good. A new meal, maybe a late night snack. Claire Beetlestone, please tell us more.
All right. This is a story of the man who is called the Saint Francis of Assisi of the Americas. He lived during the early 1600s and was finally canonized just 20 years ago in this century. Many tales, legends have arisen from his beautiful life. I'm going to tell one. His name was Say Pedro, Father Pedro. And one day he was walking along the road when he passed a poor peasant who looked so miserable. And Father Pedro said, "What is wrong? Oh, can I help you?" And he said, "Oh, my wife is dying. The doctor says if I can get special medication for her, she will live. But how can I do that? I'm poor and I don't know what to do." Now, Father wanted to help him, but he himself was also very poor. So he said, I don't have any money. And then running across the road in front of them was a lizard. And all of a sudden, Father Pedro reached down and gently took the lizard up, took it and held it to his heart. After a little while, he took the lizard and handed it to Juan. Juan was astonished. The lizard had turned to pure emerald. Juan thanked him profoundly and ran to the market, where he sold the emerald lizard for medicine for his wife, some food, and 3 cows. Well, his wife got well very quickly, and Juan was a happy man again. Years passed, and Juan prospered very much in the cattle business. And there came a day when he went back to the market, his money belt chock full, went to the merchant to buy the lizard back. And the merchant said, "No, no, no, that lizard is not for sale. This gem has brought me good luck." And one said, "And your luck will continue to be good today." And he took out the price of 10 lizards that he had been paid and said to the merchant, "Here you are." And the merchant said, "The lizard is yours." Now, Juan looked for Pedro. He looked all over the countryside, but remember, years had passed, and Pedro was old and infirm, and he had retired years ago. But Juan went here, there, and everywhere, and finally, in a remote part of the countryside, he found him. And Father Pedro says, "Ah, I recognize you." He recognized him immediately. He said, "What brings you here to this faraway place?" And one said, "You gave me a gift, and I wish to return it." "Well," said the old priest, you come in and we'll talk about it." He was invited inside. The place was very small, very poor, but very neat and clean. And he said, "It's time for our midday repast. And I have some soup here, and I have a loaf of brown bread." And they sat and they ate and they talked. And as they talked, one opened the packet he had, and in it was this treasure, this lizard of emerald. He took the lizard and put it on the table beside the bread. And of course, sunlight streamed through the window, and the desert, he sparkled. He was just beautiful. And The old father said, yes, I remember well. You know, I know exactly when that happened. Thank you so much. What a kind and loving thing you have done. Thank you. I am humble. And he took the lizard, looked at it, and took it and pressed it next to his heart. And a moment later, he brought out the lizard, put him on the table, and then put him on the floor. And the lizard woke up, shook, and ran away out the door. That's the story.
Wow. Wow. Wow.
A remarkable lesson in that story of what's priceless to different people. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. It also shows that our storytellers have to find stories they want to tell, then they have to discover how they want to tell it. Then there's practice involved before they show up on a Sunday afternoon and share it with us. So that was about 10 minutes with Claire Beetlestone, but that was just the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of the work involved. Our next teller is Kate Danaher, who is coming to us from her Florida home, not from her Troy residence. Her story is from Ireland. It's called The Looking Glass. And the food, ooh, again, another entree for dinner, beef Wellington. Claire Danaher, please share your story.
Okay, Kate, will do. You might wonder why beef Wellington is coming from Ireland, but this story involves something very special that came from London. That is, the man in the story never expected in his life that he would ever see. So it is always a mystery to me how the women got on before the looking glass was invented, or some of the men, if it went to that, they're often enough in front of it. Well, the looking glass was invented, and there was this man that was dull of the fact. He lived in an out-of-the-way place, a kind of backward community, and there was an excursion going to town. So he took advantage of the low fare to travel out. And when he got into the town, well, he walked down the main street and into this little shop where he saw a heap of these shiny things up on the counter, little oblongs, no bigger than a small cigarette box. So he took one up and to have a look at it and put it in front of his face. And he said, oh, he said, picture of my father, wherever they got it. And he said to the woman inside the counter, how much are these going for? Well, sure, it was only a trifle. So he bought what he thought was a picture of his father and he put it inside in his pocket. But before he left the shop, he said to the lady, where did she buy those? And she said they came from London. Oh, he said, London. Well, that's very strange. He's mumbling to himself. You know, he said, my father was never in London, he said to himself. He said, oh, maybe he went to London on his way to heaven. That would be it. Well, he was so happy with this, what he thought was this priceless treasure, a picture of his father. A man he had great respect for and who'd been dead for some time. So all throughout the day, whenever he got the opportunity, he was taking out and admiring what he thought was a picture of his father. Well, however, when he got home, he was very careful not to let the wife see the picture because she didn't have the same respect for the father-in-law. Well, as they say, which of them have? However, as we know, much don't escape the women. And she was wondering what it was that was taking him to his pocket and he was admiring. Well, one day didn't her chance come when a neighbor's chimney went on fire, and a very serious occurrence at that, with a thatched roof. Well, the little man, when he heard all the hillabover outside, he ran out, and in his excitement didn't he forget to take his coat. Well, he was no sooner gone than her ladyship dived into the inside pocket and took out the looking glass and put it in front of her face. "Ha!" she said. "Who's this old hairpin? And if that's the attraction that's drawing him to the cities, I'll soon put a stop to his gallop." And she put the looking glass back into the pocket, and she geared herself for battle. And we all know what women can be in such a situation. Well, the little man came home after doing a good turn for the neighbor, and of course she approached him. "Such a thing," she said. "Who's this old dolly bargain you have there inside in your pocket?" He said, "That's not a picture of any woman." He said, "That's a picture of my father." "Ha!" she said, "with a dress on him? Oh, you'll hear more about this." And putting on her hat and coat, she went out over to the presbytery to talk to Father John. And Father John, when he heard the yarn, well, you could have knocked him down with a feather, for he said that he knew her husband quite well, and he was a nice, pious, quiet, accurate, genteel sort of fella, and such a thing had never been attributed to him. "Oh, Father," she said, "he has me caught up to the ball of my eye. And what's more, he has a picture of this other woman there inside in his pocket." "Oh, that won't do," said Father John. "That would be a nice headline to be giving our congregation. I'll have to go to the house and reprimand him." So the two of them set off, and when they got to the house, Father John, he lifted the latch of the half door, and he stepped inside, and he said, "Here now, my good man, this is enough about this. Hand me out the picture of that woman you have there inside in your pocket." Well, the little man was hoping that a hole had come into the floor and swallow him. He was so upset and ashamed at the turn things were taking. But what could he do? Only go to his pocket and take out what he thought was the picture of his father, and he handed it to Father John. And Father John, of course, now he put the thing in front of his face, and he burst into a fit of laughing, and he said, "Well, the two of ye are a right pair of geniuses." He said, "Isn't that the parish priest that was here before me?" It was a looking glass.
Oh,
Oh. Oh.
A mirror,
Thank you.
in case you don't want a looking glass.
Yes. Oh, thank you, Kate Danaher Parks, for taking us to Ireland on this fine early evening that we're having wherever we are. So, to end our program today, we have Siri Allison with us from Salem, New York. Her story is a literary tale by Natalie Babbitt, titled "The Very Pretty Lady." And Siri said her story is like a refreshing peppermint candy, just what you need to finish off a fine meal. Siri Allison, there you are. Please tell us more.
Okay, yeah, I'm still laughing over that other story. I didn't get it until the very end. So yeah, this is a story by Natalie Babbitt from her book called The Devil's Storybook. And as I was working on it, I realized, well, it is a little dated in its societal assumptions, but I still think it talks about what's priceless. So that's why I'm doing it. Once there was a very pretty, and she lived all alone. She didn't have to live alone because she was so very pretty that there were many young men who wanted to marry her. They hung around in her dooryard, And here, let me stop and say, I didn't know the word dooryard until we moved to the country, and I talked to some old timers. The dooryard evidently is like your house yard as opposed to your farmyard. So these young men hung around in her dooryard, and they played the guitar, and they sang sweet songs, and they tried to get a glimpse of her through her window, and they were there from dawn to dusk, always sad, always hopeful. But the very pretty lady didn't want to marry any of them. She said to herself, it's no use being loved for the way one looks. If I can't find someone to marry me in spite of my face, then I won't marry anyone at all. Now, this was wise, no doubt, but no one is wise all the time. For the truth is that the very pretty lady rather liked the fact that she was pretty. And sometimes she would stand in front of the mirror and look at herself. And at times like this, she was rather pleased with herself. And then she would go out in the yard and talk to all the young men and let them walk with her to market and carry back her bags and packages for her. And for a long while afterwards, these young men would look a good deal more hopeful than sad. But the very pretty lady herself, she stayed almost all the time inside her cottage, feeling lonely, because she longed for someone to love her the way she wanted to be loved. Now, after a while, one way or another, the devil heard about the very pretty lady, and he thought she might be just what he needed to brighten up his days in hell. So he packed a satchel of disguises and went up to have a look at her. And he had heard, of course, about how very pretty she was, but no one had told him that she didn't allow anyone inside her house. So he disguised himself as a beggar, but she wouldn't open the door. He tried a preacher and then a king, but that didn't work either. So at last, he resorted to disguising himself as one of her other suitors and then hung around with the rest of them, waiting for market day. Well, finally market day came and the very pretty lady came out, and the devil walked with her all the way to town, gazing at her every moment. He carried back her heaviest package, and by the time she had gone back inside, he had made a decision. She was exactly what he wanted and needed in hell, and he had waited long enough to have her. So that night, after the hopeful and sad young men had all gone home, the devil threw off his disguise, and with a clap of thunder and a puff of red smoke, he wished himself into the pretty lady's bedroom. Well, of course, she woke up at once, and when she saw him, she shrieked. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "It's only me. I have come to take you away to hell." "Never," she cried. "I shan't go, and there's no way you can make me." "That's true," he said. "There isn't. You have to come of your own free will if you come before your time, but you will really like it down there. You'll be the prettiest thing in the place." "Well, I'm that already right here," she said, "for all the good it does me. Why should I go away somewhere else just to have the same thing?" "Ah," he said, "but in hell, your beauty will last forever, whereas here it can only fade." For the first time, the pretty lady was tempted, and the devil knew it. He went to her bureau and got her mirror and held it there in front of her so she could look at herself. "Well," he said, "it would really be a shame to let this pretty face go to waste. If you stay here, it'll last 15, maybe 20 more years. But in hell, there is no time. You will look just as you do now until the stars fall and a new plan is made. And we know that will never happen." The lady looked at herself and thought, it was rather nice to be pretty. But in the nick of time, she remembered what it was she really wanted. "Tell me," she said, "is there any love in hell?" "Love," said the devil. What would we want with a thing like that? Well then, she said, pushing away the mirror, I never will agree to go. You can beg from now till Sunday, but it won't do any good. Is that your final word? That is my final word. Ooh, at this, the devil grew very angry and his eyes glowed like embers. Very well, he said. I can't take you against your will, that's true. But I can take your beauty, I can and I will. And with a clap of thunder, the devil disappeared in a cloud of smoke. He went straight back to hell, taking all the lady's beauty with him. And when he got there, he tacked it up in little fragments all over his throne room, where it sparkled and twinkled and brightened up the place quite nicely. After a few years, however, the devil got to wondering about how the lady was, and so he went up to see how she was getting along. He arrived at her cottage at twilight and peered in through the window. There she was, ugly as a boot, sitting down to supper. But she was no longer alone. Candles lit the table, and sitting with her was a young man just as ugly as she. And in the cradle near her chair, there was a baby that was just as ugly. But around this table, there was such love that the devil reeled back as if he had been struck. Oh, he said, I will never understand this if I live to be 1,000,000,000. And he stomped back to hell and he tore down all the lady's beauty from the walls of his throne room and he threw it away. And from there, it floated up out of hell into a dark corner of the sky and formed itself more usefully into a new star.
Aw.
That is very pretty.
Nice job.
Oh. Thank you, Siri, for such a refreshing ending to this plethora of stories. I don't know about all of you listeners out there, but I feel well fed by these priceless stories we've heard. How about one last round of applause for all of our tellers? And for our listeners for coming. Yes. That's great. I'd like to remind you all that we are only in the middle of our season, that we have 3 more programs, Magic, Bamboozled, and Cliffhangers. Bamboozled, I think some of these stories, we won't recycle them, but you've had a taste of what they might be like. And Magic will be on February 14th with 4 of today's tellers, Kate Danaher, Marnie Gillard, Mary Murphy, and Beverly Schwartz, joined by David Bain, Fran Combsberger, Sandy Schumann, and Priscilla Sprague. So that ends our performance of Priceless. And thank you all so much for coming. And we wish you a healthy and happier new year.
And thank you, Kate, for doing all that you do.
My pleasure.